Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
In the 19th century, male dominance was the way of life, and most women conformed to this notion. Despite the conditioning to be docile, one woman emerged in the 1840s and destroyed this convention. In doing so, became one of the most famous women in the 1840s and 1850s. Her name was Abby Folsom, and she was born in Rochester in 1792. Abby was a supporter of women's rights, an abolitionist, and a notorious public agitator, who was often forcefully carried out of meetings. She was one of the first to speak of women's rights, and she was at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. In the 1840s and 1850s, newspapers across the country were filled with accounts about her. If she was not in a newspaper article, then you might find her image in a political cartoon. A few thought her courageous and a genius, while many more actually believed she was insane. She grew up in Rochester and married Peter Folsom on May 29, 1825. In 1827, according to Rochester historian Franklin McDuffie, Abby was wearing out her welcome in church with her loud outbursts. However, she would not be staying in Rochester much longer. Her husband's constant drinking forced Abby to leave him. She moved from Rochester to Boston to live with her sister Charlotte.
She joined the anti-slavery movement and became one of its loudest proponents. While other abolitionists would show a bit of decorum, Abby was the complete opposite. Her speeches and outbursts, and especially her outbursts, is what she would be famous for. Franklin McDuffie described Abby as such. She became noted as an energetic advocate of all so-called reforms, and as one of the earliest women lecturers. She was benevolent and sympathetic towards all who were suffering, whether justly or unjustly, and she would go into courts to plead for those on trial, and into the jails to seek their release, and if successful, would often take them to her home and aid them to secure employment. She was a frequent visitor to the State House, and whether there or at other public gatherings, it was impossible to keep her silent. If anything was said that displeased her, she was generally let alone to talk as she pleased. But when it came necessary to good order to restrain and silence her, she became unmanageable. She felt she had a mission and was determined to fulfill it in spite of all opposition.
William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the most famous abolitionists, wrote the following about Abby. Abby Folsom was a woman of large heart and benevolence, without means herself, but ready to help others with her good services. But there was a screw loose, as the saying is, in her mental equipment, and in season and out of season, she rose to speak when a pause occurred. Father Lampson, a picturesque lunatic, he supplemented Abby, often joining with her to defeat the ruling of the chairman. The only alternative was to remove them forcibly when patience was exhausted. I remember in Marlborough Chapel seeing Phillips and Quincy carrying Abby bodily from the hall and depositing her gently but firmly on the floor in the entry. The following newspaper articles provide more information about Abby and the extreme life she led. There are hundreds of articles about her from the mid-19th century. Most of them refer to Abby being arrested or being removed from meetings. By 1860, Abby had calmed down due to her age. She returned to Rochester and lived out the rest of her life in relative peace and quiet.
She was fond of little children and would visit schools to give them good advice or read the Bible to them. She died August 5, 1867. Abby was buried in the same grave with her sister Charlotte in the old cemetery. She lived long enough to see the abolition of slavery Regarding her sanity, or lack of it, we should remember her offenses that were similar in nature to her male counterparts. But while the men were thought passionate, Folsom was criminalized as insane. And this ends the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com and come back next month for another episode of Rochester, New Hampshire History.